Hi there, it's David Duffett here, back for another ClueCon Weekly. And ClueCon, the live event, is still planned for the 3rd to the 6th of August in Chicago. Of course, we're living in uncertain times, and so the tickets are 100% refundable in case our hand is forced and we're unable to go along with that live event. But at the moment, we're planning to head towards that. You can get more details at cluecon.com, 3rd to the 6th of August in Chicago. And James, our guest for today, I believe you're not too far from Chicago yourself.
No, I'm about 45 miles northwest of Chicago, and I've worked on different projects within Chicago in part of my career. And I guess we can go and talk about some of that a little bit later on.
Yeah, I'd very much like to do that. I'm over here in Brazil at the moment doing this, but the great thing is we're both in the ClueCon Weekly studio, James, here to talk about various different things. But I would like to begin, as you just mentioned, about your kind of history and background. I do know that you've been involved as an expert witness and also that you're a published author. But if you could give us a little bit of a background about how you developed your career and how you find yourself where you are today, that would be very useful, I think, for our viewers.
Okay, great. I think one of the things people be interested in is that my initial degree was in music education. I wasn't in software, but after I graduated, seemed to be there was better jobs available at Bell Telephone Laboratories, and that's where I went as a beginning software engineer. I wound up at Bell Telephone Labs. I got a lot of education, a lot of different focus on telephony and mission critical infrastructure. Worked with a lot of software development areas within Bell Labs. I was one of the first people that actually used Unix and C language, and that was back in the late 70s. And after that, I went to Illinois Bell, worked more in the area of design of large enterprise networks, worked with people like American Hospital Supply and the state of Illinois. And all these different areas really focused on trying to create very complex networks and tying both the large information systems and remote access at the time. And after the area of working in that, I went to Arthur Young, which is now Ernst and Young, and was director of telecom and computer hardware consulting. And then I opened up my own company in '86. And I've been involved in a lot of mission critical networks and mission critical architecture for different clients, both in the public and the private sector. And one of the things I was working on in the 90s was the Chicago 911 Center. I was the mayor's consultant on the planning and design of that center. And we were one of the first ones to use fiber optics exclusively to connect 80 buildings, both fire buildings and police buildings. And it was considered way ahead of all the other cities that had large metropolitan 911 networks. And we actually combined all the buildings together, which was never heard of prior to that.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of pioneering activities that you've been involved in, James. Are you able to tell us, without going into specific details, about any of the expert witness work that you've done?
Sure. The expert witness work, I did a lot in both civil and federal court on a large variety of cases, going from wrongful death cases on 911 calls to failures of systems for both different network carriers like Sprint and also looking at just the overall network of fiber optics within the country for AT&T, and looking at some of the issues they had with some of the resellers of their services, going back to where they had a lot of other smaller carriers reselling different network services from AT&T. So The cases were a lot involved in also taking a look at cabling infrastructure within buildings and looking at whether or not these buildings had problems, and most did. Most had a lot of wiring issues and cabling issues, and we did a lot of work as far as taking a look at some of the problems, not only with networks going into the building, but also the vertical riser system throughout the building. And this was something that it seems like we still have problems today with a lot of buildings. And I also got involved in real estate back about 30 years ago with the consulting of intelligent buildings. And I was a pioneer on a lot of the concepts in intelligent buildings where we actually took a look at how do you create a better infrastructure to support companies that are tenants for both their information systems and their communication networks. And this has been something that has been going on for a great deal. And that was one of the premises of my book, which you mentioned earlier, location connectivity.
Yes, it really does sound, James, like you've, Jim, got a mountain of experience to build on in order to be in a position to author that book. And over in the UK, we have a TV show called Location, Location, Location. So I'm familiar with the first two words of the book title, and of course, being in the telecoms industry, know that connectivity is key. But tell us about the thesis on which you based your book.
Well, the book was a focus on next generation real estate, and I discussed the convergence of real estate, infrastructure, technology, and their combined impact on regional economic development. And the book goes in through a lot of different areas that include something I talk about, the platform for commerce. The platform for commerce is an 8-layer framework where I define infrastructure from the top to the bottom. And this is something where I wrote a white paper for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security entitled Intelligent Infrastructure. And that was part of the concepts, or one of the concepts, that I put in the book. And the idea of intelligent infrastructure is something that I talk about as far as making sure that we understand what all the layers are first in infrastructure. If you talk to people, most times people have a different definition of what they consider infrastructure. And the infrastructure I talk about runs all the way back from the days of the Egyptians and the Phoenicians building ports and docks on the Mediterranean Sea to increase trade routes, all the way up to today where we have broadband connectivity, where the trade routes have become electronic. You know, we've added every layer that we add to infrastructure. We're increasing trade routes, whether it's by water, by land, by air. And today we're at broadband connectivity, using the internet, using a lot of electronic ways to increase trade routes that way. And the last layer of that infrastructure will be interplanetary. And you and I may not see it, but within the next 50 to 100 years, we'll see that there'll be interplanetary commerce, and that'll be the next layer of infrastructure. And we have to prepare for that today and plan for that. And that's something that, in the traditional sense of education that we've had, a lot of people just don't have they just don't have uh, the education that looks across multiple platforms and multiple industries.
Mm.
Most degrees, as you and I just talked about a little bit earlier, was that education and degrees focus on a silo effect of, you know, I have a degree in accounting, or I have a degree in computer science, or I have a degree in engineering. What we need to have are courses that are multidisciplinary, and we talk about several different industries and several different disciplines in one course, because people have to have that broader knowledge base today, because that's where all the projects today, you need someone that understands a project across multiple disciplines. and not just someone that has a silo-based degree of one skill or one discipline. And that's really a change within the university level that is just starting to happen, and most universities have not figured that out yet.
It's an interesting point you make there, James. I know that in the UK education system, it's general until about 14, and then between 14 and 16, it gets more specific. From 16 to 18, it gets even more specific because it's leading off into a single disciplinary degree, or sometimes maybe two subjects in the form of like a liberal arts degree or something. But I remember some years ago the French education system being held up as an example because their baccalaureate educational style gives people a very general approach right up until the age of 18. And yes, they do go on to specialise, but they bring up the level of general education for everybody.
Right. Well, you've heard the term team player, that, we need more team players. We actually need more team leaders. We need people that can see across several disciplines and direct people from several different industries to attack some of these projects, these complex projects that we have today. And the focus on a single skill set or single discipline is not as important as having skills that run across multiple disciplines, because, as I said, these projects, we talk about intelligent buildings, we talk about intelligent infrastructure. We need someone that can see the big picture. Need someone that has to have a sort of a visionary approach to combining all these different disciplines. We've got people that are focused on a single discipline, but that next layer or that next level of expertise has to cut across many different disciplines in order to attack some of these more complex issues.
Yeah, totally agree. And of course, when you come to write a book, as you have done, and I've had a go at it myself, you realise that you're building it on quite a lot of experience. But in order to separate things out and convey them properly, you need to pick things apart a bit and put it into a logical structure under some headings. And I'm sure that's the process that you would have had to go through in the book. So can you talk us through some of the headings that you've got and the points that you're making?
Sure, sure. One of the big things I saw across my career is that the focus on mission critical networks and mission critical power was very important. And I sort of lumped that into a sort of a subset called intelligent infrastructure, where we talk about redundant power coming into the building. We talk about redundant broadband connectivity coming into the building. And that means coming in from two or more different network carriers. And the same with power. You want to have an alternative power source, not just two lines or two cables to the same electronic grid. You want to have power coming from one company and a secondary source coming from a different company. And maybe you even have, depending on the application of the building, you might even have a diesel generator for power backup, for battery backup. You might even have a triple power backup. This is very important because as we look at more companies with computer applications that they depend on, we have a lot of companies that have what they consider mission critical applications. Well, mission critical application means that there's no single point of failure. If you have a mission critical application, but you only have one power source coming into the building, or you only have one network carrier coming into the building, you're going to have, you're not going to have, it's not a mission critical application because
Yeah.
there's several failure points. And probably one of the most current failures of a mission critical application was not too long ago. The Atlanta airport had a huge power failure. And what happened was they had diverse power coming into the airport, but it was running in on the same conduit. In other words, it was coming through the same exact tunnel. And what happened was they had a fire in the tunnel and the whole airport shut down. Now compare that with O'Hare International Airport in Chicago. There's 6 different power feeds coming from 6 different sources coming into that airport. So in other words, if 1 or 2 go out, they still have 4 backups where they have power coming in. So you have to look at network design and power grid design very critically, because when you look at how many mission critical applications does a corporation have, just your typical corporation, did you know it's 1 out of 3, and it's actually moving up to 1 out of 2? So in other words, every third application that a company uses is considered mission critical. That means it needs redundant power and redundant broadband connectivity. And that's moving forward because more and more companies are going all with online services and online applications.
Yeah, this was
They're
absolutely
go,
going through my mind as you're speaking, Jim, that of course some companies will have effectively, or maybe in their minds, outsourced some of this by putting stuff on servers in data centers where they know they've got redundant and diverse power. But of course, they're still accessing it over a single broadband connection with single power supply in their office. So not fulfilling exactly what you're talking about.
Exactly. And then I worked with clients like that. I worked, as I said, on the planning and design of the Chicago 911 Emergency Communications Center. I worked on several projects with the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, which is a stock exchange here in Chicago. And they have they had 80,000 circuits coming into one building. That's a huge amount of network capacity coming
Mm,
in. And when you look at the value of the trades, the values of the transactions coming into the Chicago Merc, it was over $400 trillion per year.
amazing.
So that's something that you want to have complete network redundancy. You want to have power redundancy, because in a case like that, you can't afford to go down for 5 seconds. I mean, divide 5 seconds into $400 trillion a year, and you'd be amazed at how much money that is. And if, let's say,
Mm,
battery backup and network connectivity redundancy, all those things would cost, let's say, an extra $3 billion to put in, or 4 billion. It's a drop in the bucket compared to what they would lose in less than a minute. And that's hard to fathom, but it's absolutely true. And as more companies become more dependent on cloud communications and all that, they really have to figure out, if they're not doing it, if that third party that they're hiring to do it has all that redundancy so that their systems and their applications don't go down. And I think in a lot of cases, they don't ask the tough questions to some of these third parties, because the third party wants to make a quick dollar. And they say, oh, we can do this for you for X amount of dollars. But is that redundancy really built in as best they can build it? And that's a question that, when that doesn't happen, that's when you see the lawsuits in both the federal court and civil court for system performance, or system failure.
Yeah, indeed. And so when you talk about intelligent infrastructure, are you talking about the kind that kind of self heal, when part of it disappears? So, when a diverse power feed or one of the broadband connections goes, the infrastructure kind of looks after that itself. Is that the idea of intelligent infrastructure, or does it go beyond that?
It goes beyond that, and there's actually a design concept that has changed over the years. A lot of people talk about disaster recovery plans, and this is where you have an organized shutdown, a systematic shutdown of your systems when a disaster strikes. And then when the disaster finishes or goes away, you start to rebuild and reset those systems that you've shut down. Well, in the case of a lot of companies now, they can't afford to shut down. And so we've changed the design concept from disaster recovery to business continuity. In other words, we don't care if something has crashed, or we don't care if there's been a man-made disaster or a natural disaster. Our systems are set up so that we keep in business no matter what. And that's a totally different design concept to design to, rather than disaster recovery, where we just simply take all the systems in an orderly fashion and shut them down. And then maybe in a 2 or 3 day or 4 day period or whatever, we bring them back up. Well, we can't really do that as we depend more and more on applications. And so this relatively new design focus is more on business continuity. And I just wrote an article about that with this coronavirus, where we talk about disaster plans. Are they good? You know, like some companies were talking about, oh, we might have to refer to our disaster plan in order to cope with this coronavirus. And my take, and this goes back all the way to 9/11, where some companies were caught in the World Trade Center. If they didn't have a disaster recovery plan written and tested, it was like they didn't have any disaster plan. In other words, there were three levels of preparedness: people that didn't have any disaster recovery plan, the people that did have a disaster recovery plan but never tested it, and then those that tested it on a regular basis. The only ones that came out halfway decent were the ones that had a disaster recovery plan that actually tested it, because otherwise you pay for a disaster recovery plan, it sits on the shelf for 5 years, and something happens, you dust it off, it's not going to work. It's obsolete.
Mm.
And you only find that out when you start to test it. Because if you test it every year or every 6 months, you find out, oh, geez, we don't have this, or we added a new application, but we never mentioned that in the disaster recovery plan. We better add that to
Yeah.
the plan. So that's something for people to really think about, because everybody thinks when you put all these things together, they keep working automatically. And no matter what system you're dealing with or what network, there's a percentage, maybe even a fraction of a percent, but that, it's evident that the systems are going to go down at one point, and you better
Mm.
be prepared for that.
Yes, and just as you mentioned, things might have changed internally in terms of additional applications, but equally things might have changed externally, outside as well. So anyway, yeah, I can see that having intelligent infrastructure is a very foundational thing, and so I can understand how that would be a critical part of your book, location connectivity. What other headings do you have in there?
Well, we talk about moving forward with smartphones and this new technology with smartphones, and talking about getting beyond smart buildings. The smart buildings have been around, intelligent buildings have been around for, probably about 30 years or so. But we're moving from smart or intelligent buildings to intelligent business campuses, where we have clusters of buildings and we have multiple carriers coming in and multiple power feeds coming in, because again, they need this mission critical approach for their applications. And so these are next generation um, business platforms for multiple buildings. And if you go to Asia, they're called intelligent industrial parks. Intelligent industrial parks in Asia, and intelligent business campuses in the United States. And we're moving even more from that. You heard the terms of smart grid technology and smart cities. Well, let me tell you, you can't have a smart city if you have dumb buildings. And we're exactly at that point where, a lot of people are throwing out buzzwords where, oh, we're going to have a smart city. Well, then you've got to go back to all those office buildings that you have, and you have to ensure that all of them have multiple feeds for power coming from a diverse route, and probably more. It would be much better if it's coming from a secondary power source rather than the same electric company, and multiple carriers coming into that building. If you don't have that, those buildings are not smart, they're dumb. And you can't have a smart city if you have a lot of dumb buildings within its downtown area. So when we talk about infrastructure and restructuring it and making it better, that's something that we could actually spend a couple of $1 trillion on, just improving the platform for commerce, that infrastructure that all these buildings sit upon. And that's something that I cover in the book extensively, that we talk about. If you're going to focus on 21st century challenges, you can't use 20th century solutions to solve those challenges. And that's a problem. Going one step further, that's a problem with a lot of education today. A lot of these universities have not added or changed their curricula. And what they're trying to do is package a degree program, but it's based on courses that they developed 15, 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And as I said, you can't solve 21st century challenges if what you're working with or what you're presenting is 20th century solutions. And that's something that, again, food for thought for a lot of people, that new courses are needed at the university level.
Yeah, indeed. In order to turn people out, but kind of employment ready in the multidisciplinary work that people find themselves having, project management and other things. I think, yeah, we need to move away from the fact that you come out of university and then have 10 years of work in different places before you're of any use in a more multidisciplinary role.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yes. Okay. Now, just coming back to your book, James, is there anything else that you'd like to tell us that's included in the book, or that people will draw from the book when they read it?
Well, I think one of the things I go back to is the platform for commerce. When I actually wrote the book, it was something that the U.S. Department of Homeland Security had it as a white paper that I presented at Columbia University in New York. And when I wrote the book, I included it because it was so important to create that framework that everybody could use as a common initial page when talking about infrastructure. Well, later, and I didn't know this until after the book was published, but later the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers actually adopted that as their standard. They talk about it as the business definition of infrastructure and economic growth. So if you do read the book, it's something where that concept is not just my opinion or my personal idea, but it's something that's actually been adopted by a couple of different U.S. agencies within the government. And I think that it's important because prior to that, nobody had um, a clear cut visualization of what, if we're talking about infrastructure, what does all that entail? And I think before we uh, go and try to attack some of these 21st century challenges, we really have to all get all people on the same page, especially people
Mm.
from different disciplines, because as I said, we're trying to work with people that have a silo education. And in the 21st century, I think there'll be more of a demand for degrees with a multidisciplinary focus to attack these problems that deal with power, that deal with broadband connectivity, that deal with computers, deal with clouds, that deals with drones. I mean, there's a lot of different technology that you have to understand and maybe not be an expert on. I mean, I used to talk to people in classes and say, there are no experts in this industry because it's moving so fast. The best you can be is a good student, always learning. And
Mm.
this is something where we need continual education, especially in these areas, because the degree, a lot of people look and say, well, I've got my degree, I'm done. But if you start working in these areas of mission critical infrastructure and mission critical networks, you find out that everything's moving so fast is that you don't really have a chance to sit down and say, I'm just going to rest on my degree. You have to keep learning, and
Mm.
that really includes cybersecurity and cyber warfare. We haven't really talked much about that, but I wrote a couple of white papers for the American Intelligence Journal that I'll send to you as well, and talk about cyber warfare in the 21st century. And again, this is something where traditional warfare we're pretty much prepared for. But when we talk about asymmetrical warfare, where people are using electronic and cyber types of attacks, cyber attacks, we need a whole different skill set. And the defensive parts or the defensive equipment that we need isn't so much F-35s and aircraft carriers as much as we need electronic defenses, and we need something like we have air superiority. We need something I coined a phrase, global net superiority, which is something that focuses on increasing the amount of defensive barriers that you have to thwart off all these cyber attacks and ransomware that's just becoming more and more popular, and even things where they have ransomware tied with cryptocurrencies. In other words, someone locks up your computer and says, give me a million, or not a million, but give me $1,200 to unlock your computer and send it to me by cryptocurrency. A lot of people are getting those types of messages as well lately, and I don't know if you've seen any of that, but it is common. It is common.
Yeah, indeed, and of course in telecoms, security is a major topic. Just recently I heard of telephony denial of service attacks where people are using robocallers to saturate other people's telephone systems, in a competitive way. So if you're a key cutter, for example, you might employ the services of some telephony bad guys to swamp your competitors' telephone lines with bogus calls so that they can't get any real customer calls and that the customers will come to you. Crazy stuff.
Definitely, definitely. I've written a couple of white papers, and it's part of a book that'll come out later, but I talk about nanokrieg beyond blitzkrieg. And nanokrieg is this whole idea of electronic warfare and asymmetrical warfare. And we've come a long way from the blitzkrieg of the World War II era warfare. And when we talk about nanokrieg, we're talking about defenses and attacks that happen so much longer when we take a look at different types of electronic warfare. The logistics are much different. War has been accelerated on the electronic side or electronic front, and that's something that is very critical as well. You need to prepare for major attacks that could come in every microsecond. And it can happen worldwide. It's not something where we have to logistically bring in troops and boats and ships. I mean, when you do electronically, you can just keep on sending that electronic virus or electronic malware over and over and over again. And so the whole concept is different when we talk about nanokrieg versus preparing for last year's or last war, blitzkrieg.
Yeah, that very, very good point. And the threats keep changing. And just coming back to your previous point about the platform for commerce, I'm guessing that must have been fairly robust in order for the concepts to have been picked up by government agencies. So congratulations on that. That's great stuff.
Thank you, and I will send you some things on that as well, and maybe we can continue maybe on maybe a second part talking just about cybersecurity and cyber warfare, because that's expanding into its own huge industry.
Yeah, indeed. In fact, yeah, that sounds like a very good subject for a future ClueCon Weekly. But for now, we're going to bring things to an end. I believe, well, in fact, I don't believe, I know that your book is available on Amazon because I looked it up. Location, connectivity. Is there anything else you'd just like to mention before we finish our session for today, Jim?
Well, I'd just like to tell everybody that you have to take a look at continuous education in any of these areas that we discussed today. It's not something where a degree is going to fit you well for your whole 30 or 40-year career. I know I've gone to a huge amount of courses across my career, from computer courses to network courses. And as I said, I used to tell all the people that I taught at Northwestern University when I was teaching that uh, this business or this industry runs too fast. Nobody's an expert. Nobody can be an expert. And the best you can be is be a good student, always
Mm.
learning.
Great advice. Yeah, one of the phrases I heard that I keep in mind is the day you stop learning is probably very close to the day you stop earning. So,
That's true. The more you learn, the more you earn.
great stuff, Jim. Anyway, thank you very much for being with us today. And yeah, we'll get together again to talk about cyber warfare and cyber security at some point in the future.
Great. Thank you for having me on.
Been a pleasure. Thank you.